In a world and a country that has become deeply divided on so many fronts, and then capped by an election that brought out the worst in many of us, your pastors felt it wise, and hopefully inspired by the Holy Spirit, to name that proverbial elephant in the room and address it comprehensively from a unique angle of not only biblical perspective, but discussing how a faith community like ourselves can hold on to its unity despite such potentially divisive feelings and positions. We want to open in a few moments and then later end with a quote from none other than Abraham Lincoln, someone who is often being quoted these days as the stirrings of civil unrest seem to strike a similar chord with those of his day. In his second inaugural address after the Civil War, he said this:
"With malice toward none, and with charity for all, with firmness in what is right, as God gives each one the ability to perceive it, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up each other's wounds, and to care for all." It's the spirit of those sentiments that Pastor Derek and I offer these thoughts this morning. We will be naming several issues of import on the American political stage, one at a time, giving both a conservative and a progressive slant to the issue, but then merging into how Christians on both ends of that continuum can remain in fellowship with one another, extending compassion and understanding. So here we go. The first issue we will address, because it is literally on everyone's mind, is the coronavirus pandemic.
The pandemic has surfaced as a kind of referendum on our commitment as a culture to science. Whether we're talking about our national response to COVID-19 or the environment and climate change, which is also another issue, as progressives, we find our moorings in scientific discovery and guidance. This is why we've been so frustrated with what has become a politicization of it, because we think that science is science, just like math is math. One can dislike the outcome, but can't in good faith argue with or try to dismantle the facts. It's kind of like the little girl in elementary school who was talking with her teacher about whales, and the teacher said it was physically impossible for a whale to swallow a human, because even though it's very large, its mouth is quite small. And the little girl said that Jonah was swallowed by a whale. The teacher became a little irritated and repeated that a whale cannot swallow a human, to which the little girl said, "Well, when I get to heaven, I'll just ask Jonah myself." And the teacher, trying desperately to gain her upper hand in her own classroom, said, "What if Jonah didn't go to heaven?" "Then you ask him," the little girl said. Despite our commitment to facts, where our learning curve as progressives, or our growing edge, has been, admittedly, is allowing space for the interpretation of those facts being different among different parts of society than the way that we view them. And that's difficult for us, in both perspectives, but I think particularly for progressives. But again, listening to each other, which sometimes we don't do all that well, is what's necessary in order to hear and understand where others' concerns and worries are housed. The economy is one of those arenas which are affected by things just like the pandemic and climate change. And it's just as valid of a concern. Protecting Americans' health and protecting the planet. But as progressives, while we want the truths of science to be given weight, we also need to give space for that anxiety as well, because we know it's real.
As a conservative, the issue of science, with particular relevance to the topics of climate change and COVID response, carries weight for me, because it's important to consider all sides of these issues before coming to any conclusions. There are well-informed voices on both sides, and neither should be excluded from the conversation. A balance of response is needed that takes into consideration our fundamental liberties. Clearly, climate change is upon us, but the degree to which it is human-caused has debatable elements, and there is science on both sides. Similarly, there is credible scientific debate on the degree to which COVID can be contained. The science behind the treatment and prevention of this virus is new, and it continues to evolve. Clearly, it's better to land on the side of caution in disease prevention, such as health protocols, but I remain wary of excess government intervention. The utilization of private companies to cooperate in the response through producing protective equipment, upscaled testing, and the development of vaccines, it's testament to the viability of private enterprise, which is the fundamental driver of our economy. That being said, my commitment as a Christian needs to be extending understanding to others who disagree by listening carefully and without prejudice to their positions on these issues, giving space to the merits of an alternative perspective. Because we can only advance as a society and culture through respecting each other's positions. As Christians, it is our imperative to be open to the workings of God in our midst. Sometimes the answers to issues come from surprising places, even from those with whom we might disagree. God is pushing us to be open and to be loving, and that should be the default response for us all.
And that brings us to a related kind of side issue, the one of masks. Wear them. Moving on. Let's address the topic of our relationships with other nations.
The issue of foreign relations carries a lot of weight for me, as most conservatives hold that the best way to ensure peace is through strength. Because we are a nation of opportunity and prosperity, there are international adversaries who would wish to diminish our standing in the world. In order to maintain our freedom, it's critical that we have adequate deterrent to those who wish us harm. And it's likewise important to have allies in the world who share our values and who together provide mutual support and defense against any antagonist actors who would threaten our freedom. As a Christian, my commitment needs to be extending understanding to others who disagree by recognizing that the love of God has no borders. God cares for the well-being of all humanity, regardless of national identity. Jesus tells us to show love for our enemies. I believe that it is not only possible but imperative that we show love and compassion for all people and to seek peace in our world. However, in order to do that effectively, we need to have a safe and strong country.
On this point, we actually agree, Dan, but with one caveat. I can only assume that your remarks, the remarks that you're referring, let me start that again. I can only assume that your remarks are referring to having a strong military, which, if that's the case, I totally agree. We need to be a strong nation in order to keep our people safe. My caveat is that, as you mentioned yourself, strong and positive relationships with our well-established allies is critical. You agree with that. Unfortunately, determining which relationships are pursued and which ones are discarded or approached with some skepticism has become far too politicized for my stomach. There's no avoiding the fact that progressives hearken deeply and strongly to our long-held relationships with Western Europe and similarly aligned partners on the world stage. And they tend to be, if I can borrow the word, poo-pooed by conservatives because that part of the world is viewed as being even more progressive than people like me. But I will fully admit to you, right here, and to these wonderful people, that hearing and listening to each other's perspective and about our respective angsts when engaging foreign powers on the world stage is critical. It's vital if we're going to do it with a unified voice and agenda. We must listen to and respect each other. And we can't discuss foreign relations without naming a related topic that has literally screamed for attention in our nation, that of immigration.
For conservatives, the issue of immigration carries weight, because many of us recognize and value the sovereignty of our nation and the importance of enforcing its borders in order to maintain our safety. We understand the rich history of the American melting pot and appreciate the cultural richness which comes from the blending of so many cultures into one American identity. However, there's a need for controlled and legal immigration through laws which serve to protect us from those who may not have the best interest of our country in mind. God chose to create and protect Israel as a sovereign nation. Strong borders are important to ensure our safety and our freedom. And yet, as Christians, our commitment needs to be extending understanding to others who disagree by reflecting on the multiple references and even commandments in our Bible, both in the Old and New Testaments, to offer shelter, refuge, and compassion for the stranger. It's clear in the parable of the Good Samaritan that we are to show love to others from other lands. And I recognize how this nation is a beacon of opportunity for strangers from oppressed countries and poverty-stricken countries. So we must implement our welcome of those who seek refuge through a fair and compassionate process.
As progressives, we believe in opening our borders to those who are downtrodden by their own governments, who find the need to escape physical abuse or violence perpetrated by those that hold political power in their countries. And while we are not the world's policemen, we also cannot be isolationists as we were in the beginning of our democracy. The world needs us. They need us to lead, to challenge, and to extend welcome. God's charge to Israel, since you mentioned Israel, was to take care of the stranger and the wayfarer, the vagabond. That mandate was quite clear and is repeated often in the Old Testament. However, our views on that issue are admittedly slanted, especially when considering the potential for that welcome that we want to extend to exact the price of neglecting our own citizens. I will completely cede that point. And I'll acknowledge that we must come to terms with the fact that your concerns about borders being too wide are quite valid. Our welcome to those outside of our country must be tempered with the reality of our own resources and the actual ability to extend it appropriately. But that raises another issue for me, and for many progressives. Welcoming those outside of the country is admittedly secondary to showing that welcome and acceptance to those that are already living here, namely the African American community, who have been here for 400 years and still struggle to feel welcomed in their own land. Systemic racism is a real and a powerful force and is behind much of the civil unrest that we've experienced over the last year and over many years. God calls us to love our neighbor, not boot them out of the neighborhood, or restrict their access to financial stability or forward-moving advantages. However, I do recognize that the moment we highlight one group needing attention or reparation, we risk tiptoeing into infringing on those rights of others who are no less in need of them. To this point, our patience and our listening ear has to be extended to one another. This is why there are so many conversations of race, as I'm sure you've run across from time to time. Because we as a culture simply do not know each other's plight intimately enough to justify holding strong opinions about racism until we've heard the voices of those who have suffered at its hands and those of others that we disagree with.
Actually, I completely agree with you on that point, Derek.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Furthermore, the focus of racism speaks to the overarching topic of marginalization. And one highly divisive issue that spins out of that is healthcare.
As a conservative, the issue of healthcare is really important to me because I feel strongly that that the government should not mandate that any individual have insurance or suffer a penalty. Conservatives feel very strongly in the value of small government. As bureaucracy grows, so does inefficiency. Some of the promises made with passage of the Affordable Care Act have not happened. And the Supreme Court is now considering the constitutionality of those same mandates. However, as a Christian, my commitment needs to be extending understanding to others and affirm the idea that all who need medical services should have access to them, regardless of their ability to pay. The dictum to care for the poor and needy permeates our Bible throughout both Testaments. As Jesus was the great healer, so too are we as Christians obligated to offer compassionate care to the best of our ability. But as a conservative, the less government intervention, the better.
Progressives don't tend to see government as the problem, but rather the lack of consideration for those who are unable to pay or have access for the things that we deem to be human rights rather than privileges. Unfortunately, the only practical way in a democracy to assure those rights are granted is to build them into the tax code, thus requiring government action. We view it in the same way that we do the right to access to education, an issue which will be notably absent from this morning's commentary. So what conservatives view as infringement on individual rights, we view as fulfilling the human mandate to protect our communities. But I do get it, and so do many of my conservative friends and colleagues. Every established nation in every century of human history has struggled with distrust of governmental power overreach, and mostly with good reason. I see our job as not only listening to each other's concerns, but also then building those concerns into our mutually determined plans and our answers to the healthcare crisis. And it's unavoidable that talking about healthcare brings us to that inevitable and infamous cornerstone of American political divide for decades, that of abortion.
As a conservative, the issue of abortion is highly significant to me. As many of us understand the miracle of life beginning with conception. I look to Psalm 139 that tells us how God knew and loved us before we were born, how He knitted us together in our mother's womb. However, as a Christian, my commitment needs to be extending understanding to others who see this issue differently by accepting and valuing the God-given choice, God-given gift of individual choice, and valuing and affirming the difficult emotions that a woman goes through in making the choice to terminate a pregnancy. Understanding that that choice can be life-altering and enduring. And this is where I recognize the healing nature of God, who is with us in times of struggle and stress, who understands our conflicts and our pain, and who recognizes our need for compassion.
On the issue of abortion, my personal opinion differs from my political one. Ironic as that may sound. For me personally, abortion cannot simply be a well-worn, easily accessible path for birth control. Because no matter how we define an embryo or fetus, or how young it is in its development, science does support the idea strongly that in some of its earliest stages, it shows signs of life independent of the mother. That being said, I still identify as progressive because I don't even begin to think or assume that I can relate to the emotional or psychological plight of a woman, especially a young woman or a teenager, who finds herself not only unexpectedly pregnant, but with no conceivable way in her mind to support this child should it come to term. The financial and social and psychological implications are well above my pay grade. And I can't assume to speak for her or for her needs, nor am I comfortable consigning them to quick biblical answers or conservative opinions, even ones that I hold myself. And this doesn't even begin to address how they can be compounded by a violent conception. If we can't make room for those women to have recourse outside of the traditional carrying to term, then we must provide something else that extends empathy instead of judgment, and understanding in the place of condemnation. And in the same spirit, to your point, we must extend an olive branch to those who believe in the sanctity of life, which I do, and honor the desire to protect those lives whenever possible.
There are a lot more issues, both social and political, that we could include in this morning's address. But we felt that these were the most pressing on society in the current moment, and most likely pressing on you.
We don't pretend even remotely to be politicians or to be politically savvy. But we do have a good sense of what God's mandate is on our lives and on our call as pastors of this church. To look after the spiritual well-being of the faith community that God has charged us with. And felt the need to name these things, these issues, in light of and against the backdrop of God's call on us to support one another, to prefer one another, as Paul says, and to love one another.
So what's the bottom line here? Listen to each other. If you have people in your life or in this church that you're close to, but have felt estranged from because of the current political landscape, talk to them. Listen to them. Be open to them.
Create space to get to know the part of someone that you're close to or acquainted with that thinks differently from you. See what they have to say and listen with an open mind. Not for the purpose of changing your mind or you theirs, but for keeping communication open and realizing that none of us have all the answers. None of us know all the angles, or are privy to all of the information, or embody all of the wisdom there is on any issue.
And remember, keeping the faith isn't just about thinking the right way about something. It's about loving and staying in relationship with God and with each other.